we're going to be looking at the social impact of the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, the Industrial Revolution revolutionized the social life of Europe and the world. Um, Although the Western world would not become a predominantly urban society until the 20th century, cities and towns had already grown dramatically, and this is one of the key features of the Industrial Revolution, its urbanization. Um, so the key features of the Industrial Revolution, we're looking at change. There's constant change. It's changing the way people work. Manufacturing is no longer being done in people's homes. Notice the cottage industry. Manufacturing now is being done in what was called then, on the early Industrial Revolution, places of work. Later on, they're going to be known as factories. The owners now own the means of production. They own the machines, and the people are just hired to work in these factories and for a set number of hours and to perform a set number of tasks. Also, with the Industrial Revolution, is changing the way people are living and where they're living. We're going from a predominantly agricultural society to where more and more people are moving to the cities and looking for work. You have displaced agricultural workers who have to find a way to earn a living. They've been displaced because of labor-saving machines that have been developed, like the McCormick Reaper, for example, or the enclosure movement. They've lost land, so they have to go to the cities where the factories are to look for work. It's also changing dramatically the way that people are thinking. We have, of course, we've always had poor people and very wealthy people. We have an emerging middle class, which are factory owners, industrialists, managers, and a new social class, the working class. These are the urban workers, and definitely a change of the way they're going to be thinking about how they're working and where they're living. Inventions also, this is another key feature of the Industrial Revolution. Inventions like the steam engine, first developed by Thomas Newcomen, who developed an atmospheric engine, but it's going to be a Scotsman by the name of James Watt who is going to perfect the steam engine, and rather than relying on running water as a source of energy for these factories, the steam engine is going to be used to as a source of energy to fuel rotary engines, to move looms and spinning machines. The cotton textile industry really does fuel the Industrial Revolution. It really paves the way here. Factories no longer have to be located on rivers and streams. You can build them anywhere. And they're going to be building in the cities. That's where you're going to be your labor force. And railroads too. It's another feature of the Industrial Revolution. They're going to put a steam engine on a locomotive, and railroads are going to allow for faster production, cheaper production, as raw materials are being shipped to these factories on rail lines, and also the finished product is being shipped out to the domestic market and worldwide on steamships. So also, a key feature of the Industrial Revolution is, of course, urbanization. And urbanization, you're going to see a dramatic growth in the first half of the 19th century of cities and towns. And that's a phenomenon related to industrialization. And cities, they've been traditionally been the centers for princely courts, government, military offices, church, and commerce. But by 1850, especially in Great Britain and Belgium, they're rapidly becoming places for manufacturing and industry. With the steam engine, entrepreneurs, they can locate, like I said earlier, their manufacturing plants in urban centers where they have ready access to transportation facilities, as well as unemployed people from the country, and they're looking for work. So you're going to see a dramatic growth of cities. I'm going to use London as an example here for the growth of the population in the cities. And London in 1800, it's got a population of 1 million people, and England overall has 6 cities with populations between 50,000 and 100,000. And 50 years later, London's population is going to explode. You're going to have a population close to 2,400,000. Now England has 9 cities over 100,000 people, 18 cities with populations between 50,000 and 100,000. Altogether, in England alone, there's 28 cities that account for 5.7 million people living in urban areas. That's about 1/5 of the total British population. And then when you look at populations of cities under 50,000, when you add that to that total, then we realize that there's more than 50% of the British population that lived in towns and cities by 1850. So as a result, Britain is going to be forced to become a food importer rather than an exporter, as a number of people involved in agriculture declined to 20% of the population. So we're going to be looking at the living conditions in these cities. You had this dramatic growth of cities in the first half of the 19th century. It produced miserable living conditions for many of the inhabitants. Of course, the quality of life, it had been poor for centuries for many people in European cities. But the rapid urbanization associated with the Industrial Revolution, it intensified the problems in the first half of the 19th century, and it made these wretched conditions all the more apparent. City authorities of whatever kind either felt little responsibility for these conditions, or more frequently they just didn't have the skills to cope with the complex new problems that's associated with the rapidly growing populations. City authorities, they might also often could be factory owners. They possess little or no tradition in public service or public responsibility. Wealthy, middle-class inhabitants, as usual, insulated themselves as best they could. They often are living in suburbs or the outer ring of the city, where they can have individual houses and gardens. In the inner ring of the city stood the small row houses, some with gardens, and you also see the artisans and the lower middle class living in that area. And then finally, located in the center of most industrial towns were the row houses of the industrial cities. They have to be close to the factories where they're working. There's a report that on the working class housing it's from the British city of Birmingham, and it was published in 1843. It kind of gives you an idea of the general conditions that the urban working class faced. This report said, quote, "The courts of working class row houses are extremely numerous. A very large portion of the poor houses, a very large portion of the poor classes of the inhabitants reside in them. The courts vary in the number of houses which they contain, from 4 to 20, and most of these houses are 3 stories high and built, as it is termed, back to back. There is a wash house, an ash pit, and a privy at the end or on one side of the court, and not infrequently one or more pigsties and heaps of manure. Generally speaking, the privies in the old courts are in the most filthy condition. Many of which we have inspected were in a state which renders it impossible for us to conceive how they could be used. They were without doors and overflowing with filth." End quote. Privies, that is their toilets. And many times you would have, all these families living in a section of row houses sharing the one outhouse. The report also mentioned the pigsties. If they're coming from an agricultural background, they're used to growing their own food, raising their own food. So it's not unusual to have pigs living in the cities. And pigs were the early garbage collectors. They didn't have a system of garbage collecting in the early Industrial Revolution. People who actually lived in these row houses were actually the fortunate ones. The truly unfortunate ones were those forced to live in cellars. Rooms were not large, they were frequently overcrowded, and the sanitary conditions of these towns, they were just appalling. There was, you had a lack of municipal direction. City streets were often used as sewers and open drains. And part of that, too, is that if you're sharing a privy, so at night, what was customary is that when you have to use the toilet or the privy, at night. You didn't want to get up and have to march and all the way down and use it. You would get up in the night and use a chamber pot. And this was just, expected. And in the morning, they'd fling out the slop out into the streets. And there were the streets. They were used as, like I said, sewers and open drains. And there was no gutter system, sewer system where water or waste or anything else would flow and then move into this sewage system. It would usually go to the lowest point of origin, which would be the basements. So when disease did break out and illness in a neighborhood, it was those who were living in the cellars that died first. So you've got human excrement, and cities in these new industrial areas, they just smelled horrible, extremely, extraordinarily unhealthy. Towns and cities were fundamentally death traps, and deaths actually outnumbered births in most large cities in the first half of the 19th century. And only the constant influx of people from the country kept them alive and growing. And then also adding to the deterioration of urban life was the adulteration of food. Previously, again, coming from an agricultural background, people knew where their food was coming from. They either raised it or grew it themselves, or they knew the people very well where they were getting it from. Consumers in the cities were defrauded in a variety of ways. Flour, when you go purchase flour, the merchants, and not all of them, but some of them were unscrupulous, they would add chalk to make the flour go farther, and of course it would look nice and white. Also, you could charge more for it. Beer and milk would be watered down, and to make meat look like it'd been well seasoned and healthy, they would use red lead in their meat. Despite, of course, its poisonous qualities, they would substitute it for spices and pepper. Some shopkeepers, once was reported that, and it was his employee who reported on this, he would buy candles, melt down the wax, add brown paint, and then let it harden into squares, and he would sell it to children, calling it chocolate. So the government just refused to intervene. It's not until 1875 that the British government parliament passed an effective Food and Drug Act, and that was to try to, make sure that the food supply was healthy and the consumers were not being defrauded. Our knowledge of the pathetic conditions in the early industrial cities, it largely comes from an abundance of social investigations. These investigations began in France in the 1820s. In Britain, you had the Poor Law Commissioners. They produced detailed reports. And the investigators, they were often struck by the physical and morally debilitating effects of urban industrial life on the poor. They observed, for example, that the young working class men were considerably shorter and scrawnier than the sons of middle class families, and they are also more subject to disease. So one of the best of these new breed of urban reformers was Edwin Chadwick. He's coming from a middle class background. Many of these reformers are coming from the middle class. And Chadwick, he became obsessed with eliminating the poverty and squalor in the metropolitan areas. And he was the secretary of the Poor Law Commissions. He began this passionate search for detailed facts about the living conditions of the working classes. And after 3 years of investigation, Chadwick summarized the results in his report on the condition of the laboring population of Great Britain, and it was published in 1842. And he concluded that, quote, the various forms of epidemic, endemic, and other diseases were directly caused by the atmospheric impurities produced by decomposing animal and vegetable substances, by damp and filth, and close, overcrowded dwellings amongst the population in every part of the kingdom. End quote. Chadwick argued that these conditions could be eliminated. Chadwick was advocating a system of modern sanitary reforms consisting of efficient sewers and a supply of piped water. 6 years after his report, and largely due to his efforts, Britain's first Public Health Act was created, and out of this came the National Board of Health. And the National Board of Health, this empowered to form local boards that would establish modern sanitary systems. Many middle-class citizens, they were quite willing to support the public health reforms of men like Chadwick because of their fear of cholera. Cholera is a diarrheal disease. You get it from drinking contaminated water. And you had outbreaks of this deadly disease. It ravaged Europe in the early 1830s and again in the late 1840s. It was especially rampant in the overcrowded cities. And city authorities and wealthier residents became convinced that the healthy conditions helped to spread the filthy conditions, helped to spread the disease, and they began to support the call for these new public health measures, which then began, England and London especially began to create this modern sanitary sewage system. And in London today, what they initially began building is still in use today. It was built so efficiently, and the designer also took into consideration that London's population is even going to grow even further than what it was in the 1850s.